Hello, my name is Suna Smith. I'm a pianist based in Toronto, Canada. The talk that I'm going to give today is actually a prequel to a concert on the same subject to be performed in the 2022-2023 concert season. The Reformation was one of the great turning points in history, not only for the church, but for the society at large. Sociologists and historians have noted the Reformation's influence on literacy levels and how it precipitated a shift in the role of family and community. Government and lawmaking was also impacted as it exhorted territorial princes to take on new duties to uphold its vision. The Reformation invigorated the medium of the printing press, fashioning a new frontier in this battle for hearts and minds. This unintended revolution toppled the mightiest institution of its day, one of the mightiest of all time, and the redesign affected a sea change that ran through modern-day Germany, Scandinavia, the UK, and eventually North America. Its reverberations can be felt in the waters of society even today. For Martin Luther, the call to reform, and it was reform that was his original aim, was one compelled by the Word of God. The pivotal source of this insight being that letter of the Apostle Paul, written to the newbie Christ followers in Rome. Paul wrote, quote, "Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law," unquote. That can be found in Romans chapter 3, verse 28. These are strong words from the apostle who had been an impeccable lawkeeper before his conversion. What of the church's institutions, traditions, and good works? Mit unserer Macht ist nichts getan. Wir sind gar bald verloren, wrote Martin Luther in his hymn Ein feste Burg. You might know these words as, did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Another translation might be something like, with our power or with our might is nothing done. We're losing already, or we will be losing very soon. Thus, driven by his own conscience, a conscience that was newly emancipated by a gospel of God's full grace, Luther experienced a great conversion, and he was compelled to tell others. The story famously goes that Martin Luther defiantly walks up to the cathedral in Wittenberg and nails his 95 Theses to the door, a list of grievances regarding the practices of the church, particularly, though not exclusively, the sale of indulgences. It's an irresistible David and Goliath story, one man against not only his employer, but the juggernaut institution of his day. The myth blooms in the incredible figure of Martin Luther, the gruff but principled visionary whose singular action created an earthquake with fault lines that are still visible in the sidewalks of society today. Of course, like many legends, the story is both true and not true. I like the way Peter Marshall puts it in his The Reformation. It's part of the Oxford University Press's set of a very short introduction books. He writes, quote, "It's probably safer to believe that all the myths about the Reformation are true, rather than that none of them are," unquote. Luther was hardly the first to call for reform. Consider the many councils that had been convened, or the movement headed by Jan Hus in Prague. Luther was hardly the first to support access to the Bible in one's own language. Wycliffe translated the Bible into English at the end of the 1300s. And it was not entirely clear what would come from that October day when Luther delivered his points for debate on the university's notice board. Nevertheless, Luther was the leader who was uniquely positioned geographically, historically, temperamentally, and in his giftings to spark a resistance that some sociologists and historians assert laid the groundwork for the modern world as we know it. The purpose of this sectional is to uncover the theology of the Reformation as expressed in its hymns and plot its influence on the cultures into which it was adopted. The Reformation, which began in Wittenberg, exported its thinking via Gutenberg's press and its hymns from Germany to Switzerland and Scandinavia to the UK and eventually across the ocean to the New World. Part of the reason that Luther was able to disseminate his ideas was that he lived in the tiny backwater town of Wittenberg. It was once asked of Jesus, can anything good come out of Nazareth? But for Luther, this location proved to mark the crossroads of a geographical and historical advantage for Luther. Geographically, Wittenberg had the protection of its small townness. Who was expecting anything to come out of Wittenberg? And importantly, it fell under the protection of Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Historically, Emperor Maximilian was on his way out. The poor man spent the last 5 years of his life traveling with his coffin wherever he went, just expecting his death. And Frederick the Wise held one of the 7 votes for choosing the successor. So Frederick, though he was a loyal Catholic, founded Luther's university, and Luther was doing excellent things for the university's reputation and prestige. Also, Wittenberg had a printing press, arriving in 1502, only 15 years before the eruption that was the 95 Theses. And it was through this invention that we see Luther's gifts take hold. Via the printing press, Luther became an influencer. Appealing directly to the public, to the masses, Luther, a terse and talented writer, threw his debate into center ring, instead of keeping it in Latin, where it would have stayed safely in the hands of the reliable religious scholars and elite, as his contemporary Erasmus had done. Furthermore, this effort was done at a massive scale. Luther flooded the market. In Andrew Pettigree's book, Brand Luther, he details Luther's mastery of this social media platform, producing highly readable small pamphlets in German. Luther was able to flood this market. So Pettigrew provides some necessary context, reminding us that the printing press, invented in the mid-1400s, often faced bankruptcy and failure in its early days, including in Wittenberg. But Luther grabbed this industry by its horns. In Wittenberg, from the introduction of its first printing press in 1502 to 1516, the year before the 95 Theses, there were 5 printers in Wittenberg that printed a total of 123 titles. From 1517 to 1546, however, 2,721 titles were printed. That's something like 3 million individual copies, and 1 in 3 of these were Luther's. Mark Edwards, in his book, Printing, Propaganda, and Martin Luther, gives us an even wider scope. In the first 3 decades of the 1500s, around 10,000 pamphlets were issued from the presses of German-speaking lands. Of these, almost 3/4 appeared between 1520 and 1526, and most of these dealt with the Reformation. Martin Luther accounts for about 20% of this overall total. So Edward writes, quote, "It's the magnitude of the effort and its overwhelming use of the vernacular that justifies designating this the West's first large-scale media campaign," unquote. Also being printed, of course, were the hymnals. Christopher Boyd Brown, who wrote Singing the Gospel, relates the surprising fact that there were more hymnals being printed than even New Testaments in the 16th century. Luther, beyond being a talented writer, had a gift for music, a gift he was only too willing to put to this purpose. Compare this to his counterparts, Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich, also a talented musician, who did not want to use music because it was too powerful, or John Calvin in Geneva, who advocated a spare form of singing using only the Psalms. But to Luther, what better way to express the inexpressible than in music? To have a sure standing in front of the eternal judge, this was a confidence that the church of the day would have equated with arrogance and folly. Next to the word of God, Luther wrote, music deserves the highest praise. So Luther used one in the service of the other, and his strategy was spot on. Luther's hymns went before his message, turning the soil of people's hearts, producing a new perspective. Both Luther's proponents and detractors were aware of the phenomenon. The German Jesuit Adam Conzen said that Luther had, quote, destroyed more souls with his hymns than with all his writing and preaching, unquote. So what were those hymns saying that so many should be affected? We will begin by looking at that giant of a hymn that has lifted spirits and strengthened resolve for generations. a mighty fortress, ein Festival. I've quoted from it already. It's based on Psalm 46. I'm going to share my screen so you can see that psalm. We can read it together. In my view, the hymn employs the language of Luther more than that of the psalmist. If you look beyond the first few verses, which are referenced in the hymn, to verses 4 and 5, we read that there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. For the psalmist, peace was nigh, on the borders of the city, on the other side of this night. His sights were set on that everlasting kingdom. For Luther, the destination might have been the same, but he and the people to and for whom he wrote were living very much in the reality of an earthly realm. Lives were in danger. The opposition was strong. Therefore, Luther's hymn dwells very much in the place where the battle is still being fought. So after the opening lines that talk of fortresses and formidable waters, the psalmist moves his sights to the city of God, whereas Luther ventures off to face the ancient foe, whose armor is cruelty. He's armed with cruel hate. What would embolden this middle-aged university professor, lifelong adherent to the church, to amplify the already bold language of the psalmist? And why did the people who heard it respond? There's something appealing in his appeal. The urgency of a threat, but also a way out. Luther believed that he was living in apocalyptic times. So wrong was the teaching, he considered the papacy the Antichrist. So eternal the consequences, so monumental the fight. But the only thing graver than the jeopardy was the surety of the rescue. Luther was buoyed. The early printings of the hymn, which reveal a melody that's more dance-like, then make a lot of sense. Rather than the march-like sort of military quality many of us associate with the hymn today, it was originally cast in an almost lilting, dance-like kind of quality. I'm going to share with you a performance by Collectio Musicorum, which the permission to share this has generously been granted by Dr. Jeff S. Daly, Artistic Director. I think you'll hear what I mean in this performance.
Ein fester Bund ist unser Gott, ein Gute Lehr und Waffen. Hilft uns frei aus allen Not, die uns jetzt hart betroffen. Der bald böse Feind mit jetzt jetzt weit, groß Macht und still ist, sein grausam Rüstung ist, auf dem ist nicht sein Gleiche.
I'm sorry to cut that off mid-word, but we'll just listen to the first verse for now. I think the other thing is that you can hear support for all 5 solas of the Reformation in this hymn. Now, the solas were compiled later as a summary of the convictions of the Reformation. Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone, and to the glory of God alone, these 5 solas. So this idea of the dependency on Christ, if you look at verse 2, we're not the right man on our side. Our striving would be losing this dependency on Christ himself. Then this idea of sola fide, dependency on faith. We will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. And there's something really nice if you look over at the German. There's the reflexive use of the verb fürchten. I apologize about my German pronunciation, but there it is. There's something really nice about the German reflexive. Fürchten wir uns nicht so sehr. This supports this idea that we have a part to play in our faith or in our fear. We move ourselves from one or the other. If we continue to look at verse 4, we can read about this dependency on the Bible, that word above all earthly powers, that word above all earthly powers. So it's the word that abides, that supersedes every scary, horrible, or wonderful thing on this earth. And I think that the entire hymn is covered in the other two solas of sola gratias, grace alone, and soli Deo gloria, glory to God alone. Because in all of it, throughout this hymn, Luther tells us that God is working. It's his protection, his strength, his spirit that is being extended to us and through us. Now, one could say that there sure are a lot of solas, alones, in this lawless theology of Luther's, but all of these alones, all of these solas, point to God and away from us. Discarded is the scorecard of religious works. Replacing it is a hymn that is replete with promises. Going back to the beginning, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. God is our mighty fortress. He is our mighty fortress. He helps us in all of our trouble. And this idea of not trouble, it's a theme in many Lutheran hymns. Erasmus accused Luther of making life seem harder so that Luther's message would shine brighter. But I don't think many of us would have trouble imagining that the hardships of the person in Luther's day. I mean, we have our own, right? We understand this sense of not. And what of that line in verse 4? The body they may kill. It's this culminating statement, this final verse, the climax. For us in modern North America, it may seem like hyperbole. But for Luther and his audience, it was the stuff of firsthand experience. Michel de Montaigne, a philosopher, wrote in his essay, De l'âge, of age, in 1575, quote, "To die of old age is a death rare, extraordinary, and singular, a privilege rarely seen," unquote. To the average person, then, who had little agency in life, how radical would the idea be that even though they take everything from us, let goods and kindred go? And if you look over at the German, it's even more plainly written. Nehmen Sie den Leib, Gut, Kind und Weib. Let goods and this sort of, they take from us life and goods and name and child and wife. Even then, in this sort of list of and, which has to mean everything. But even then, nothing is lost. The kingdom shall stay with us. In the English version here, it says, his kingdom is forever. But the German, again, is a little bit more adamant and more personal. He writes, Das Reich muss uns doch bleiben. That idea, the kingdom shall stay with us. The Nordic countries were quick to take to Luther's reforms. The King of Denmark and Norway, Christian III, established Lutheranism in Denmark in 1536 and in vassal Norway in 1537. Meanwhile, in Sweden, its church declared independence from Rome even earlier in 1527, but didn't adopt Lutheranism until close to the end of the century. Still, the impact of Lutheran theology on Nordic countries was unmistakable. The history surrounding Ein feste Burg is a complicated one. The popularity and omnipresence of the hymn means that it's twisted around the history of the people who sang it. So for many countries, this is a song to sing in the face of one's enemies, whoever or whatever they might be. For Finland, A Mighty Fortress is akin to a national anthem sung at communal events outside of the church, whereas for Sweden, there's an opposite reaction. There was an investigation into Lutheran hymns conducted by Nordhymn in the early 2000s. It hypothesizes that, quote, the Finns have quite fresh memories of wars, crises, distress, and sufferings, unquote. It goes on to say that Ein feste Burg has become music of the collective sufferings. It it's associated with collective consolation and national identification. Whereas in Sweden, where there's been established stability and prosperity, the hymn was not found to be, quote, of current interest. In Norway, Einfesteborg is associated with a more recent protest. It was sung around the locked doors of their church that contained the Nazi-sympathizing clergyman who was installed in place of their own. So it banded the people together in the face of this tyranny. In Iceland, Einfesteborg was associated with the powerful Danes, from whom the Icelandic people struggled to gain their independence. So for them, it was a symbol of the unwanted. In fact, there are a number of Lutheran hymns that have a long history throughout the Nordic countries, Einfesteborg certainly, but also Aus tiefer Not, out of the depths. It's one of the earliest hymns that Luther wrote, and it was known to have been an effective instrument in expanding the Reformation. It's based on Psalm 130. Again, I will share my screen so we can read the psalm together. Both for the original psalmist and for Luther, it has a ringing opener. Out of the depths I cry, aus tiefer Not schrei ich. Hearing a prayer so eloquently and sincerely expressed, it can be a balm, it can be an invitation to anyone who's facing similar trouble. Again, that idea of not aus tiefer, there's a typo, aus tiefer Not schrei ich. But this idea, again, this out of trouble, we're crying out of our trouble. But here too, Luther offers redemption. It's the same redemption that he himself knew and experienced. Luther's translation reads, Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir. And this dir, it's employing the familiar, not the formal, which would have been zu ihnen. This is a cry directed to a God with whom there's intimacy. He is close, and these cries are heard. In this hymn, Luther sticks more closely to the text of the original psalm than he did in Einfesteborg. But compare verse 4 of the psalm, with you there is forgiveness. Let's compare that to verse 2 of the hymn. In verse 2 of the hymn, this idea of forgiveness, but with you, nothing but your grace and favor counts in the forgiveness of sins. Luther just can't let that sweet word of forgiveness go by without adorning it. And he's not done yet. He continues in verse 2 to confess that even the best life needs this grace and favor. Luther had tried to live the best life, but he spent so much time confessing because living this way exposed human flaws as well. Like a champion in any field knows, every mistake is a mistake that can cost you. So you have to root them out. Now, it's not that the Catholic Church didn't believe in grace. It's not that they didn't believe in the authority of the Bible, but traditions and teachings and practices crept in over the centuries that sort of muddied this message. To Luther, one such questionable teaching was purgatory, this place of purification or temporary punishment for the dead. In purgatory, one waits until their debt is fully paid. Who knows when that will be? You keep this idea of penance and prayers. You keep repenting and praying, and you wait in purgatory. But Luther here follows the lead of the psalmist and encouraged the believer to wait, not for a judge, not for the prison guard who would finally release you from purgatory, but one waited for God, my consolation and my refuge. This my consolation and faithful refuge. Here again, there's that intimacy, that sweetness. The psalmist had said that he waits, my soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning. But Luther presses the point. In his hymn, he writes, and even if it delays through the night and again in the morning, Yet, in God's might, my heart will not doubt nor be anxious. Luther didn't make light of his unworthiness, of the sins of our race, of the sins of human beings. He just made God's grace bigger. Oh, bei uns ist der Sünden viel, bei Gott ist viel mehr Gnade. Although there's much sin among us, with God there is much more mercy. Here's a verse of Aus tiefer Not, as sung in Danish. I'll put up the Danish text so you can see it. This recording is taken from the Folkekirken.dk website. You can see that website here. I'll just play you again, just a verse. From the earliest publications of songs, there were fewer melodies than texts, with the idea that a single melody could suffice for multiple poems, as long as they fit metrically. Such is the case with Aus tiefer Not. The melody we just heard is attributed to Luther with probable help from Johann Walter, Luther's main musical collaborator. And it was the melody that was employed by Bach in his cantata 38. Ein Festeburg was written on Psalm 46. Aus tiefer Not is written on the text of Psalm 130. The Book of Psalms was a major source of inspiration for the songs and hymns of this generation. These were 150 poems from the Hebrew Bible, or Christian Old Testament, that are songs and prayers from King David and various other musicians and priests of ancient Israel. John Calvin, mentioned earlier, was a younger contemporary of Luther's and one of the leading figures of the Reformation. He was stationed in Geneva, but Calvin's approach to music was stricter than Luther's, and it was under Calvin's guidance that the Genevan Psalter was produced. These were syllabic melodies, that is, one note per syllable, something like, angels we have heard on high, not melismatic like the Gloria section of that same song. These were unaccompanied. These songs in the Psalter were unaccompanied so that nothing should detract from the text. Here's one example melody from the Genevan Psalter. You might know it. If you have spent any time singing in church, you may already be fitting words to this tune in your head. And of course, this is what Luther was going for. But this melody is a good example of how these tunes were fit to multiple poetic settings. The original French version by Théodore de Bèze is based on Psalm 134. But another popular version was by the Scotsman William Keith, based on Psalm 100. So the text would have been completely different. In fact, you might know this tune as the Old Hundredth, based on William Keith's version. If, however, you're singing, praise God from whom all blessings flow, in your head, then you are singing the version by Thomas Ken, a bishop in the Church of England. In England, it would not be until the likes of Isaac Watts, 1674 to 1749, so a contemporary of Bach's, that they would move away from the Psalters, like the Genevan Psalter, and create a hymn tradition of their own. Perhaps you sang Watts's "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross" this past Easter. Or maybe you heard, you were hearing "Joy to the World" at Christmas, also another Watts hymn. Watts's hymns used more melodious tunes, and these tunes were fit to English text and not from translation. Moreover, as we saw with Luther, Watts' texts were responses to scripture. They're more personal. And again, imbued with that wonder, the wonder that results from regarding these psalms, these songs, these texts through the lens of the New Testament, after God had revealed his plan and sent his promised Messiah in the form of his Son, after there had been a cross and resurrection, after death had been swallowed up in life. Eventually, Watts's hymns would make it across the pond to the New World. He was in close contact with an influential Puritan minister named Cotton Mather, his hymns being published there as early as 1712, according to the Christian Institute of History. But it was George Whitfield's preaching tour of the American colonies in 1738, that Great Awakening, that Watts's hymns came to the fore. Again, from the Christian Institute of History, quote, "Whitfield championed Watts's hymns, which were better suited than the metrical psalms to his fervid style of preaching," unquote. John and Charles Wesley, the great hymn writers of the generation to follow Watts, actually made it stateside to Georgia as missionaries in 1735. All of these songs, Watts and Wesley songs, will be more fully explored and performed in the concert to come. In his seminal work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, written in the early 1900s, the sociologist Max Weber linked the world's most productive economies to Protestantism. The teachings of the Reformation's Swiss counterparts, Zwingli and Calvin, paired civic-mindedness with their faith. John Knox was highly affected by Calvin's teaching and work during John Knox's exile in Geneva in the mid-1500s, and Knox carried these ideas back with him to Scotland. Later, it was the English Puritans who exported these ideas to the New World. Harvard sociologist Joseph Henrich conducted experiments on Westerners, assigning them the acronym WEIRD for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. These experiments reveal that Westerners' tendency toward conformity is weaker than those exhibited in other parts of the world, and that Western societies are more individualistic, being more guilt-driven rather than shame-driven. So that means that this idea that they're experiencing guilt because they have failed in their own private evaluation rather than losing faith in the eyes of others. Henrich traces this bent toward individualism and analytic thinking to the Reformation. Yes, these weird groups include countries that stayed true to the Catholic Church, and Henrich describes how this church, before there was such a thing as Protestantism, disrupted the extended family unit. But the Reformation, through its literacy and schooling programs, through its teaching, propped up the standing of the individual. Not only are individuals equipped to feed themselves through literacy, but there's a shift in the process of evaluation that values mental states in moral judgments. That is this idea of assigning violations different levels of wrongness depending on whether they were intended or not, rather than simply on gross outcome. And this makes sense in light of this idea of sola fide, the sola fide of the Reformation, this dependency on faith alone, because it's faith which is not a visible thing, rather than deeds which determine one's salvation. So without outward proof, faith can't be stamped as good by an institution or onlookers. It's just weighed against scripture and one's own conscience. Again, this is highly individual. The scholar Alec Ryrie also sees Reformation's focus on the individual. In his book, Protestants, the Faith That Made the Modern World, he talks about free inquiry in democracy. Free inquiry is this idea that there's the refusal to follow another to allow someone else to rule your thinking. So this is the idea of free inquiry. And democracy, maybe not as a political thing, but democracy as in the responsibility of the individual in the face of an authority whose actions run counter to your beliefs. So free inquiry and democracy, in both of these ideas, the individual is the agent. Quote, the idea that the individual has a right, even a responsibility, to stand up against a tyrannical or anti-Christian ruler is implicit in Protestantism from the beginning, unquote. Ryrie adds an important third aspect, which is the limitation of government. This third freedom meant freedom from government through a new system in which the government only had control over practical things. And these three factors, free inquiry, democracy, and limited government, are what Ryrie says makes up liberal market democracies. Another quote, quote, it runs the modern world, and though it seems obvious to us that liberty and equality should go together, it is not at all an obvious combination. It is that distinct heritage of Protestantism in holding those models together that is its most significant contribution to the modern world, close quote. And look at how these Reformation hymns are directed to the individual. Consider that wonderful song, Nun freut euch, lieben Christengemein, dear Christians, one and all rejoice. It was published in the first hymn book, the Achtliederbuch of 1524. In actuality, this is not really a hymn meant to be sung in church, but like Luther's first song, it tells a story. Luther's first song, Ein neues Lied wir heben an wahr, which means a new song, here shall be begun, was a response to the martyrdom of two Augustinian monks who were sympathizers of the Reformation. Andreas Löwer, in his essay, Why Do Lutherans Sing?, calls that song a Zeitungslied, a newspaper song commenting on current events. Löwer writes, quote, in an age of significant illiteracy, singing the Reformation message to popular tunes was a powerful and effective means of disseminating views. Löwer goes on to write that these songs were communicated by word of mouth, letter, broadsheet, and they were sung throughout Germany. Importantly, even in Catholic regions where Luther's writings would have been banned. So unlike previous hymns that we talked about today that were based on a psalm, this is more of a ballad, like a story. There's a lovely little video I'd like to recommend to you on YouTube. It's from the Evangelische Festgottesdienst in Nuremberg. It's their service for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see it. You can see that the stage is literally set for this dramatization, and it includes a performance of Nun freut euch, lieben Christengemein, dear Christians, one and all rejoice. And it nicely captures this idea of the newspaper song, this Zeitungslied, because you're going to see it being performed sort of outward to an audience telling the news. You'll see his character run onto stage, and he's quite excited. He's saying, a new song fresh off the presses from Martin Luther, and he invites everyone to kind of listen. So why don't we listen to that a little bit?
Ein neues Lied von Dr. Luther, ganz frisch aus der Druckerpresse. Kommt alle her und hört mir zu. Nun freut euch, lieben Christengemein, und lasst uns fröhlich springen. Das Weget los und all in ein, mit Lust und Liebe singen. Was Gott an uns gewendet hat, und seine süße Wundertat, Gott teuer hat dieser Worte.
We're going to leave it there for just a moment. What ensues, there's more dramatization. There's a kind of kerfuffle between a couple of characters. One is, I think, the parish priest or something like this, where they want to sing the song inside of the church service. And he's finally allowed to do that. So you'll see a character run up to him and say, sing this song about this merciful God. Sing this song about this merciful God. So we're going to jump ahead to that section. And for that, once we get there, I will actually show you the text so that we can see what they're singing about. So here, he's invited to sing.
Singt, Kepner, singt es laut, das Lied von der Barmherzigkeit Gottes.
Again, we'll just leave it there for a moment and talk about the text. So this story, it is a story, but it's a story that does share that message that Luther, about the doctrine of the Reformation, this idea. He does talk about sin and justification. In the companion books to the Lutheran hymnal, they talk about this as being of the doctrinal genre because it does set forth Luther's understanding of sin and justification. So it is a story. It's how Luther was transformed. And so this personal conversion story becomes public, just like Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. You can see here, fast bound in Satan's chains I lay. This, again, it's very personal. This sin and potential emancipation were for the individual. It was my own good works that availed me not. And so it's my fears that are increased till sheer despair left naught but death to be my share. So this is Luther's conversion story. But the effect of this story could be communal. It's a personal story, but the effect can be communal. Lieben Christen gemein, right? Dear Christians, one and all. And so this is an address, yes, to Christians, one and all, but it's also a vision. Did you notice the singing of the congregation along with the last verse? This was a practice that was encouraged and intended. No longer the domain of the priesthood, participation in church, participation in one's own eternal destiny was put in the hands of the common person, now able to read the Bible themselves, empowered to write. This idea that joy wants to be shared, and this sharing bubbles up, bubbles over into an even greater joy. Martin Luther was a man of struggles, uneven, imperfect. If you're a Luther fan, it might be satisfying to hear about that mic drop moment between Zwingli and Luther at the Marburg Colloquy of 1529. This attempt to find reconciliation between these grand reformers regarding the practice of communion. Zwingli believed the meal was a memorial meal. Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," when he sat at the table of the Last Supper with his disciples. Luther, though not believing in the Catholic idea of transubstantiation, where the bread is the body of Jesus, he believed that Jesus was present at the meal. So after Zwingli launches into a verbose display of his erudition, which was considerable, Luther sweeps away a cloth to reveal the 4 words he'd previously scrawled in chalk on the table. Hoc est corpus meum. of course in Latin, "This is my body." These are the words that Jesus said as he broke the bread at the table. So he's scrawling it on the table. This is an event that happened at the table. So it's this huge mic drop moment, right? But Luther was not a ready-made hero. He was stubborn, he was capable, he was charismatic and courageous, yes. And these are winning qualities for the leader of a movement, but he was not a perfect figure. And there's a lot of writing on that as well, of course. Luther, when he was asked to denounce his beliefs at the Diet of Worms, he asked for a day to consider his decision. He later regretted this wobbling on his part. This is, part of being human, and he was entirely human. In his essay entitled "A Sincere Admonition to All Christians to Guard Against Insurrection and Rebellion," written in 1522, when you were allowed to write titles that long. But he wrote, quote, "I ask that men make no reference to my name. Let them call themselves Christians, not Lutherans. What is Luther? After all, the teaching is not mine. Neither was I crucified for anyone." St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 would not allow the Christians to call themselves Pauline or Petrine, but Christian. How then should I, poor stinking maggot fodder that I am, come to have men call the children of Christ by my wretched name? Close quote. Again, this might be swept aside as exaggeration, this idea of Luther maggot fodder, or, the Apostle Paul also talked about the filthy rags, even his best deeds being filthy rags. They might be passed off as sort of, or passed over rather, as sort of exaggeration. But instead, these, I think, are their attempts to impress upon us with the strongest language possible so that they would not be mistaken. Luther did not deconstruct the church's practices for deconstruction's sake. But it was that Luther, in its place, he wanted to build something glorious. In the words of Alec Ryrie, quote, "Before any of this was a theological system for Luther, it was a love affair." Close quote. In his essay on the freedom of a Christian, Luther unpacks what he considers certain incomparable benefits of the faith. One is that it unites the soul with Christ as a bride is united with her bridegroom. Luther's movement was a love song, wooing its listeners into a new relationship, a new romance. For us today, especially if you're someone tuning into a sectional on Reformation hymns by the Hymn Society of America, then the communicative power of music, its contagion character, may be self-evident. These musical faith testaments have occupied the spaces of minds and hearts across cultures and time, perhaps in a different language or using a different tune, but there is endurance here. There is visceral potency. If you're someone who knows the power of a certain piece of music, just like hearing a fragment of its melody can carry you back to a different time, a different context, a different world, then you know not only how music can win a person over, but you also know how much more lovely it is to be thus won over. Thank you so much for listening today. As I said, this lecture is going to be filled out into a performance, which we will do in the coming season. And we'll perform hymns in the various languages and talk about the text. So if you enjoy this type of thing, please, I will share my contact info with you. And you can, if you'd like, if your institution would like to host a performance, please reach out to us. The website is newyorkpoetryandsong.org. I was very long based in New York. And you can also write us newyorkpoetryandsong@gmail.com. Thank you so much.